June 14, 2024, the day a Venezuelan submarine almost changed everything. Let me tell you about the moment I first saw the reports. It was a quiet Friday afternoon, the kind where most of the world is already checked out for the weekend, scrolling through sports highlights or planning barbecues. Then, buried in a routine Pentagon briefing, came the Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine Miscalculated its approach to the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower carrier strike group in the Caribbean. At first glance, it sounded like a minor incident, another near miss in the crowded waters of global power projection. But if you've spent as many years as I have studying the fault lines of great power competition, you know that the most dangerous moments in history often begin with a single miscalculation. I've been tracking naval incidents like this for decades, from the Pueblo crisis in 1968 to the Belgorod submarine's shadowy deployments in the Arctic today. And let me be, this wasn't just another routine patrol gone wrong. This was a Venezuelan vessel, a Russian-built, Chinese-upgraded Kilo-class submarine, to be precise, testing the limits of American tolerance in what has become the most strategically volatile region in the Western Hemisphere. The mainstream media barely noticed. The White House downplayed it. But here's what they're not telling: this was a deliberate probe, a calculated escalation, and a warning shot across the bow of U.S. hegemony in its own backyard. The official: a simple case of naval incompetence. According to the Pentagon's initial statement, the Venezuelan submarine Cibalo inadvertently closed to within 12 nautical miles of the Eisenhower strike group while it was conducting routine operations in international waters. The U.S. Navy claims the sub was detected well in advance, tracked by P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, and that no aggressive maneuvers were observed. The Venezuelan government, for its part, issued a terse denial, calling the reports fabrications designed to justify imperialist aggression. The State Department followed up with a stern but measured rebuke, emphasizing that reckless behavior in the Caribbean threatens regional stability. The media, predictably, ran with the simplest version of the story. CNN framed it as a close call but reassured viewers that no shots were fired. The New York Times buried the incident in a short wire report, noting that tensions in the region have been rising but offering little cant. Even the more hawkish outlets like Fox News treated it as a footnote, another example of rogue regimes testing American resolve, but nothing to lose sleep over. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just incomplete, it's actively misleading. Deconstructing the what really happened. First, let's talk about the submarine itself. The Cibalo isn't some rusting relic from the Cold War. It's a Project 636.3 Kilo-class submarine, one of the quietest diesel-electric boats in the world, purchased from Russia in 2018 with Chinese financing and technical support. These subs are designed for stealth. They can lurk undetected for weeks, capable of launching anti-ship missiles, laying mines, or even deploying special forces. The fact that the U.S. Navy claims to have detected it well in advance is either a lie or an admission that Venezuela now possesses a submarine that can challenge American dominance in the Caribbean. Second, the timing. The Eisenhower strike group wasn't just passing through the region. It had been deployed to the Caribbean in response to a series of escalatory moves by Venezuela, and it's the action of Russian military advisors in Caracas, the construction of a new Chinese signals intelligence facility in Cuba, and the recent joint naval exercises between Venezuela, Russia, and Iran in the Atlantic. The sub's approach wasn't an accident, it was a message. Third, the location. The incident didn't happen in some remote corner of the ocean. It occurred near the Aves Island, a strategic outpost that Venezuela has been militarizing for years. This is a choke point for maritime traffic, a potential staging ground for anti-access/area denial operations, and most critically, a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. has long considered the Caribbean its exclusive sphere of influence. A foreign submarine operating with impunity in these waters isn't just a provocation, it's a declaration that the old rules no longer apply. Finally, the response. The U.S. didn't scramble fighters. It didn't deploy additional assets. It didn't even issue a formal protest to Moscow or Beijing. Why? Because the Biden administration is trapped between two: bad escalate and risk a wider conflict, or downplay the incident and signal weakness. So they chose the latter, hoping the story would fade. But in geopolitics, weakness is its own kind of provocation. The broader geopolitical why this matters. Let's out for a moment. What we're witnessing isn't just a Venezuelan submarine playing chicken with an American carrier. It's the latest move in a global struggle for dominance between the US, Russia, and China, a struggle that is rapidly reshaping the international order. For Russia, Venezuela is a beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, a way to distract and divide American attention from Ukraine and the Middle East. Putin has been explicit about in 2019, he called Venezuela a strategic partner and pledged to defend it against external pressure. The sub-incident is just the latest in a series of Russian moves, military advisors, Wagner Group mercenaries, and now submarine deployments that signal Moscow's intent to challenge US dominance in its own neighborhood. For China, Venezuela is a critical node in its Belt and Road Initiative, a source of oil, and a testing ground for its growing military footprint. Beijing has been quietly extending its presence in the Caribbean for years, building ports, upgrading military facilities, and most importantly, providing the financial lifeline that keeps the Maduro regime afloat. The Kilo-class submarine is a Chinese-Russian hybrid project, and its deployment near a U.S. carrier is a not-so-subtle reminder that Beijing is no longer content to play by Washington's rules. And for the United States? This is the nightmare, a multipolar challenge to its unipolar moment. The U.S. has spent the last 3 decades acting as the world's sole superpower, enforcing its will through military dominance, economic sanctions, and diplomatic coercion. But that era is ending. Russia and China are no longer passive observers, they're active revisionists, seeking to carve out spheres of influence where American power is checked, if not excluded entirely. The Caribbean is the perfect place for them to start. It's close to the U.S. homeland, it's a critical transit zone for global trade, and most importantly, it's a region where American influence has been in decline for years. The Monroe Doctrine, once the bedrock of U.S. foreign policy, is now a relic. And the Venezuelan submarine incident is proof that the new players don't care about the old rules. Military, the escalation ladder. Now, let's talk about the military reality. The Eisenhower Strike Group is one of the most powerful naval formations in the world, a floating fortress of air power, missile defense, and electronic warfare capabilities. But here's the thing about they're the great equalizer. A single Kilo-class boat, if undetected, could sink a carrier with a salvo of caliber cruise missiles before the U.S. even knew it was there. The U.S. Navy knows this. That's why they've spent billions developing anti-submarine warfare capabilities, from the P-8 Poseidon to the Virginia-class attack submarines. But the problem is that the Kilo is designed to evade exactly these systems. It's quiet. It's maneuverable. And it's operated by a crew that, while not as experienced as the U.S. Navy's, has been trained by Russian and Iranian advisors. So what happens next? The U.S. has a few options, none of them. 1. Do nothing. This is the path of least resistance, and the one the Biden administration seems to be taking. But it sends a dangerous that the U.S. will tolerate foreign submarines operating near its carriers. That's an invitation for more probes, more tests, and eventually, a real crisis. 2. Increase surveillance. The U.S. could deploy more ASW assets to the region, additional P-8s, Virginia-class subs, even unmanned underwater vehicles. But this is expensive, and it risks further militarizing the Caribbean, which could backfire politically. 3. Escalate. The U.S. could issue a formal warning to Venezuela, Russia, and China, backed by a show of force, perhaps a live-fire exercise near the Aves Island. But this risks a tit-for-tat response. What if Russia sends its own submarines to shadow U.S. carriers in the Mediterranean? What if China does the same in the South China Sea? 4. Preemptive strike. The most extreme option, and the one that some hawks in Washington are already whispering about, would be to disable or sink the Sabalo before it can pose a real threat. But this would be an act of war, and it could trigger a wider conflict with Russia and China. Here's the hard: none of these options are good. The U.S. is caught in a classic security dilemma. Every move it makes to secure its dominance in the Caribbean risks provoking a response that makes the region less secure. And the more it tries to assert control, the more it incentivizes its adversaries to challenge that control. The domestic political why this is about more than just Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the American politics. The Biden administration is in a precarious position. With the 2024 election looming, the last thing it wants is a foreign policy crisis that could be spun as a weakness narrative. But here's the administration's hands are tied. On one side, you have the hawks, Republicans like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, who are already framing this as a national security failure. They're demanding tougher sanctions, more military deployments, and even regime change in Venezuela. On the other side, you have progressives in the Democratic Party who are wary of another military entanglement, especially in a region where the U.S. has a long history of interventionism. The result? A policy of strategic ambiguity. The White House is trying to thread the needle, condemning Venezuela's actions without committing to a military response, while quietly pressuring allies like Colombia and Brazil to take a harder line. But this approach is unsustainable. The longer the U.S. avoids a clear response, the more it emboldens its adversaries. And let's not forget the oil factor. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. The U.S. has been trying to isolate the Maduro regime for years, but with global energy markets tight, there's growing pressure to ease sanctions and re-engage. This incident complicates that calculus. If the U.S. backs down on the military front, it risks looking weak. If it doubles down, it risks destabilizing global oil markets. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case, a return to normal tensions. In this scenario, the incident fades from the headlines. The U.S. increases surveillance in the Caribbean but avoids a direct confrontation. Venezuela, Russia, and China dial back their provocations, at least temporarily. The Eisenhower Strike Group completes its deployment without further incidents, and the status quo is maintained. But here's the status quo is unsustainable. The U.S. can't keep patrolling the Caribbean indefinitely, and its adversaries know it. This scenario is just a pause, not a resolution. Scenario 2, the most likely, a slow burn crisis. This is the scenario I'm most worried about. The U.S. responds with a mix of military posturing and economic pressure, more sanctions, more naval patrols, perhaps even a limited cyber operation against Venezuela's military infrastructure. Russia and China, in turn, escalate their support for Caracas, sending more advisors, more weapons, and perhaps even deploying their own naval assets to the region. The result? A low-intensity conflict that simmers for months, even years. The U.S. finds itself bogged down in a new front, one that drains resources and attention from more critical theaters like the Indo-Pacific. And all the while, the risk of a miscalculation and accidental collision, a mistaken missile launch, grows. Scenario 3, the worst case, a direct confrontation. This is the nightmare scenario. The U.S. decides it can't afford to look weak and takes direct action, perhaps sinking the Cibalo or striking a Venezuelan military facility. Russia and China respond by increasing their military presence in the region, perhaps even deploying their own submarines to shadow U.S. carriers. The situation spirals into a full-blown crisis, with the risk of direct conflict between the U.S. and its adversaries. Now, I'm not saying this is likely. But it's not impossible. And the more the U.S. tries to assert its dominance, the more it increases the chances of this outcome. The grand strategy why the U.S. keeps losing. Here's where we need to have a serious conversation about American grand strategy. For the last 3 decades, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it can maintain global dominance through military power, economic coercion, and diplomatic pressure. But this approach, what scholars call liberal hegemony, is failing. Look at the Iraq and 2 decades of war, trillions of dollars spent, and what do we have to show for it? Failed states, regional instability, and a resurgent Taliban. A humanitarian intervention that turned into a disaster, with the country now a haven for terrorists and human traffickers. A proxy war that dragged on for years, with Russia and Iran emerging as the winners. A noble cause, but one that has exposed the limits of American power. The U.S. can't even fully fund Ukraine's defense, let alone enforce its will on Russia. The pattern is the U.S. keeps trying to shape the world in its image, but the world keeps resisting. And the more it tries, the more it overextends itself, the more it provokes counterbalancing coalitions, and the more it weakens its own position. The Venezuelan submarine incident is just the latest example of this dynamic. The US sees the Caribbean as its backyard, but Russia and China see it as a battleground for influence. And the more the US tries to enforce its dominance, the more it incentivizes its adversaries to push back. What should the US do instead? So what's the alternative? Let me be, I'm not suggesting the US should abandon its interests in the Western Hemisphere. But it needs a smarter, more sustainable strategy, one that recognizes the limits of military power and the realities of a multipolar world. Here's what I'd 1. Diplomatic engagement. The US should reopen channels with Venezuela, not as a concession, but as a way to reduce tensions. This doesn't mean lifting all sanctions or recognizing the Maduro regime, but it does mean finding areas of mutual interest like counter-narcotics operations or energy security that can serve as a basis for dialogue. 2. Economic statecraft. Instead of relying on sanctions that hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime, the US should focus on targeted measures that disrupt the networks of corruption and repression that keep Maduro in power. This means working with allies to track illicit financial flows, freeze assets, and expose human rights abuses. 3. Regional alliances. The US can't go it alone in the Caribbean. It needs to strengthen its partnerships with countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, offering them incentives to take a harder line against Russian and Chinese influence. This means more economic aid, more military cooperation, and most importantly, more respect for their sovereignty. For a military restra, the US should avoid the temptation to respond to every provocation with a show of force. Instead, it should focus on deterrence, making it clear that any attack on US assets will be met with overwhelming force, but avoiding unnecessary escalation. This means investing in asymmetric capabilities, cyber, drones, special forces, that can counter threats without triggering a wider war. 5. Grand strategy reassessment. The US needs to accept that it can't be the world's policeman. It needs to prioritize its core interests, protecting the homeland, ensuring free trade, and maintaining a favorable balance of power in key regions, and accept that it can't micromanage every crisis. This means reducing its military footprint in places like the Middle East and Africa, and focusing on the Indo-Pacific, where the real long-term challenge from China lies. Now, I know what some of you are, this sounds like appeasement. But let me be, this isn't about giving in to Russia or China. It's about recognizing that the US can't sustain its current level of global engagement without risking overstretch, bankruptcy, and defeat. The alternative isn't a stronger America, it's a weaker one, bogged down in endless conflicts, with its adversaries growing stronger by the day. The bigger a world in transition. At the end of the day, the Venezuelan submarine incident is about more than just a single boat and a single carrier. It's about the end of an era, the era of American unipolarity, and the beginning of a new one, where power is more diffuse, where alliances are more fluid, and where the old rules no longer apply. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but its margin of dominance is shrinking. Russia and China are no longer content to play by Washington's rules. They're building their own institutions, their own alliances, and their own spheres of influence. And they're doing it in America's backyard. The question: how will the US respond? Will it double down on its fading hegemony, or will it adapt to a world where it must compete rather than command? Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate headlines. The Venezuelan submarine incident isn't just a close call, it's a symptom of a much larger shift in how great powers operate in the 21st century. For decades, the US Navy has enjoyed unchallenged dominance in the Western Hemisphere, treating the Caribbean and even the South Atlantic as its own maritime backyard. But that era is ending, and the submarine near the USS Harry S. Truman is just the latest data point in a trend that's been building for years. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about China's quiet but relentless action into Latin America, a region that Washington has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. Since 2005, China has invested over $180 billion in the region, according to the Inter-American Dialogue, and that number is growing by the year. Beijing isn't just selling cheap goods or buying commodities anymore. It's building ports in AMA, deepwater ports in Argentina, and even a space tracking station in Patagonia that some U.S. intelligence officials believe has dual-use military applications. And then there's the Belt and Road Initiative, which has signed up nearly every major Latin American economy, including Venezuela, Ecuador, and even traditionally US-aligned countries like Chile and Peru. Here's the uncomfortable: China isn't just challenging US economic dominance in Latin America. It's laying the groundwork for a long-term military presence. And Russia is doing the same, albeit on a smaller scale. Moscow has been supplying Venezuela with advanced weaponry for years: S-300 air defense systems, Su-30 fighter jets, and even the infamous Club K containerized missile systems that can be hidden in civilian cargo ships. But the real game-changer is the nuclear cooperation. In 2022, Russia and Venezuela signed a deal to build a nuclear research reactor in the country, a move that raised eyebrows in Washington. And just last year, Russian nuclear-powered submarines made port calls in Cuba and Venezuela, a clear signal that Moscow is testing the waters, literally, for a more permanent presence in the region. So why does this matter for the submarine incident? Because Venezuela's submarine, likely a Russian-made Kilo-class or a Chinese-built Yuan-class, isn't just a rogue actor's toy. It's part of a broader strategy by America's adversaries to erode US dominance in its own neighborhood. The Kilo-class, for example, is one of the quietest diesel-electric submarines in the world, designed specifically to operate in shallow waters like the Caribbean, where US anti-submarine warfare capabilities are less effective. And the Chinese Yuan-class? It's equipped with air-independent propulsion, meaning it can stay submerged for weeks at a time, making it a nightmare for US naval forces to track. Now, I can already hear that this is just Venezuela being Venezuela. They're broke, their military is a shell of what it once was, and their submarine probably couldn't even fire a torpedo without breaking down. And to some extent, that's true. Venezuela's military is a shadow of its former self, hollowed out by corruption, brain drain, and economic collapse. But that's missing the The real threat isn't Venezuela's military capabilities, it's the precedent this sets. If a failing state like Venezuela can get away with probing US carrier strike groups without consequence, what's to stop a more capable adversary, say, Iran or even China, from doing the same in the future? Let me put this in historical context. In 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other time in history because the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The US responded with a naval blockade and a credible threat of military action, and the Soviets backed down. But today, the dynamics are different. The US is no longer dealing with a single, rational adversary like the USSR. It's dealing with a patchwork of revisionist powers: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, each with its own grievances, its own strategies, and its own willingness to take risks. And unlike the Cold War, where both sides had clear red lines, today's conflicts are playing out in the gray zone, where the rules are unclear and the stakes are deliberately ambiguous. So what does this mean for US military strategy? First, it means that the US Navy can no longer assume it will have unchallenged control of the seas, even in its own hemisphere. The days of the Blue Water Navy, where US carriers could sail wherever they pleased without fear of attack, are over. The rise of anti-access/area denial capabilities, like China's DF-21D carrier-killer missiles or Russia's hypersonic Kinzhal missiles, means that US carriers are increasingly vulnerable, even in regions where the US has historically dominated. Second, it means that the US needs to rethink its approach to deterrence. For decades, US deterrence has been based on the idea of escalation dominance, the belief that the US can always out-escalate its adversaries because of its overwhelming military superiority. But in a world where adversaries are willing to take asymmetric risks, like sending a submarine to shadow a US carrier, escalation dominance is no longer a given. The US needs to develop a more nuanced approach, one that combines traditional military power with cyber capabilities, economic coercion, and diplomatic pressure. Third, it means that the US needs to invest in new technologies and new ways of fighting. The submarine incident near the Harry S. Truman is a wake-up call for the US Navy's ASW capabilities, which have atrophied since the end of the Cold War. During the 1980s, the US had a fleet of over 100 P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft, dozens of nuclear-powered attack submarines, and a network of underwater listening posts designed to track Soviet subs. Today, the US has fewer than 50 P-8 Poseidon aircraft, a shrinking submarine fleet, and a sonar network that's been neglected for decades. Meanwhile, China is building submarines at a rate of 2 per year, and Russia is modernizing its own fleet with new stealth technologies. But the biggest challenge isn't just technological, it's strategic. The US needs to accept that it can't be everywhere at once. For decades, the US has operated under the assumption that it can project power globally while also maintaining a presence in every region. But that's no longer sustainable. The US needs to prioritize its core interests, protecting the homeland, ensuring free trade in key choke points like the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal, and maintaining a favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, and accept that it can't micromanage every crisis. This brings me back to my earlier point about grand strategy. The US needs to shift from a strategy of primacy, where it seeks to dominate every region, to a strategy of selective engagement, where it focuses on the most critical threats. That means reducing its military footprint in the Middle East, where the US has been bogged down in endless wars for 2 decades, and shifting resources to the Indo-Pacific, where the long-term challenge from China lies. It also means accepting that the US can't dictate the behavior of every country in its hemisphere. Venezuela is a basket case, but it's not going to invade Florida. The real threat isn't Caracas, it's Beijing and Moscow using Venezuela as a proxy to undermine US influence. Now, I know what some of you are, this sounds like retreat. But let me be clear, this isn't about abandoning the Western Hemisphere. It's about recognizing that the US can't afford to be the world's policeman anymore. The alternative isn't a stronger America, it's a weaker one, stretched thin, with its adversaries growing bolder by the day. The Venezuelan submarine incident is a warning sign. It's a reminder that the world is changing, and that the US can't afford to cling to the strategies of the past. The question is whether Washington will adapt or whether it will keep sleepwalking into a future where its dominance is no longer guaranteed. Now, what most people don't realize is that this incident isn't just about submarines or carrier strike groups, it's about the slow-motion collapse of US deterrence in its own backyard. And that collapse isn't happening in a vacuum. It's the result of 2 decades of Washington treating Latin America as an afterthought, a region where the only real policy was either benign neglect or heavy-handed intervention when things got too messy. The Venezuelan submarine blunder is just the latest symptom of a much deeper. The US has lost the ability to shape outcomes in its own hemisphere without resorting to the same old tools: sanctions, threats, and the occasional coup that no longer work the way they used to. Let me explain why this matters for domestic politics. The Biden administration's response to this incident has been telling. There was no immediate escalation, no dramatic show of force, no demand for regime change in Caracas. Instead, we got a carefully worded statement from the Pentagon about unprofessional behavior and a reminder that the US remains committed to the security of the region. That's not weakness, that's realism. But realism isn't a message that plays well in Washington these days, where the foreign policy establishment is still addicted to the idea that the US can and should dictate terms to every country within its sphere of influence. Here's the uncomfortable: the US no longer has the leverage it once did in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, and no amount of chest thumping from Congress is going to bring it back. Take the case of Venezuela. Since 2019, the US has recognized Juan Guaidó as the country's legitimate president, imposed crippling sanctions on the Maduro regime, and even flirted with the idea of military intervention. And what's the result? Maduro is still in power, Venezuela's economy is in ruins, and the country has become a client state of Russia and China. The sanctions have hurt ordinary Venezuelans far more than the regime, and the US has been left looking impotent. Now, I'm not saying the US should lift sanctions tomorrow or recognize Maduro. But what I am saying is that the current approach isn't working. And yet, in Washington, the debate is still stuck in the same old: either we double down on regime change, or we surrender. There's no middle ground, no room for a strategy that actually accounts for the realities on the ground. That's a problem, because the longer the US clings to failed policies, the more it erodes its own credibility. Let's talk about the domestic political dimensions of this. The Venezuelan submarine incident has already become a talking point for both sides of the aisle, but neither party is asking the right questions. On the right, you've got figures like Senator Marco Rubio tweeting about Maduro's aggression and calling for a strong response. On the left, you've got progressives like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pointing to the incident as proof that the US needs to end its imperialist policies in Latin America. Both sides are missing the The issue isn't whether the US should be tough or soft on Venezuela, it's whether the US has a coherent strategy at all. The reality is that Venezuela is a failed state, and failed states are inherently unpredictable. The Maduro regime is desperate, isolated, and increasingly reliant on Russia and China for survival. That makes it dangerous not because it poses a direct military threat to the US, but because it's a wildcard that could drag the US into a crisis it doesn't want. Imagine if that submarine had actually collided with a US vessel, or if a Venezuelan pilot had mistakenly fired on a US aircraft. The pressure on the White House to respond would have been immense, and the risk of escalation would have been real. That's the nightmare scenario for any being forced into a conflict by a miscalculation from a rogue regime. So what's the alternative? The US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a problem to be solved and start treating it as a reality to be managed. That means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and that the US needs to find ways to contain the fallout from Venezuela's collapse without getting dragged into another endless conflict. It means working with regional partners like Colombia and Brazil to stabilize the situation, rather than trying to go it alone. And it means recognizing that the real threat isn't Caracas, it's Moscow and Beijing using Venezuela as a foothold to undermine US influence in the hemisphere. Now, I can already hear the objections. But if we don't stand up to Maduro, won't that embolden other adversaries? That's the same logic that got us into Iraq and Afghanistan. The truth is that the US can't afford to police every failed state in the world. It needs to pick its battles, and Venezuela isn't one of them. The real battle is in the Indo-Pacific, where China is challenging US dominance in ways that actually matter. If the US wants to maintain its global leadership, it needs to stop wasting resources on peripheral conflicts and start focusing on the core challenges. Here's another uncomfortable: the US public doesn't care about Venezuela. Poll after poll shows that Americans are far more concerned about domestic issues, economic inequality, healthcare, climate change, than they are about what happens in Caracas. And yet, Washington keeps acting as if Venezuela is a top-tier national security threat. That disconnect between elite priorities and public sentiment is dangerous, because it creates the conditions for policy failures that could have serious consequences. Let me give you an example. In 2019, the Trump administration came within a hair's breadth of launching a military strike on Venezuela. The plan, reportedly, was to use a combination of airstrikes and special forces to take out Maduro and his inner circle. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, but the fact that this was even on the table is a sign of how detached Washington's foreign policy establishment has become from reality. The US public wasn't clamoring for war with Venezuela. Congress wasn't demanding it. And yet, the idea of a quick, decisive military action was seductive to some in the administration because it fit the old "if there's a problem, bomb it." That's the danger of a foreign policy that's driven more by inertia than by strategy. The US keeps doing the same things it's always done, even when those things no longer work. And the result is a series of self-inflicted wounds, like the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, the failed maximum pressure campaign on Iran, and now the slow-motion collapse of US influence in Latin America. So where does that leave us? The Venezuelan submarine incident is a wake-up call, but it's not the only one. The US is facing a world where its adversaries are more assertive, its allies are more skeptical, and its own resources are more stretched than ever. The question is whether Washington will adapt or whether it will keep sleepwalking into a future where its dominance is no longer assured. Let me leave you with this thought. In 1962, the US faced a far more serious challenge in its own hemisphere when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Kennedy administration responded with a mix of diplomacy, military pressure, and back-channel negotiations that ultimately resolved the crisis without war. That was a masterclass in crisis management, but it was also a product of its time. The US was at the height of its power, and the Soviet Union was a peer competitor that understood the rules of the game. Today, the US is dealing with a different kind of adversary, one that doesn't play by the old rules. Venezuela isn't Cuba, and Maduro isn't Khrushchev. The US can't afford to treat this as a Cold War rerun. It needs a new playbook, one that recognizes the limits of American power and the realities of a multipolar world. The question is whether Washington is capable of writing it.